I think what's fascinating with a lot of our guests is just how many of them are involved in music as well. And so I'm not surprised that this is also part of your background, Jim. Where did your love of games come from? Do you have any early memories, with playing games or building games that you can share?
Sure. I worked at Microsoft for a long time, as you mentioned, and a surprising number of people there have both math and music backgrounds. They seem to tie together. We can have a philosophical discussion about why, but it's quite common. One of the best programmers who worked for me had a degree.
All right. Well, we just got done speaking with Jim Horne, and Jim is the man who brought FreeCell to Microsoft. And that was a really great conversation. Aaron, did you have any takeaways?
Well, I think you'll appreciate the story, and I don't want to spoil it, of just how the game got into Windows in the first place. I thought that was just a fun story, but I'll leave it to Jim to tell you that. Nate, how about you?
Well, if we're going to be a little ambiguous, then I will say him being office buddies with Steve Ballmer is also worth paying attention to. So, Jim had a lot of great stories, especially if you're a fan of Microsoft in the 90s. I think that there's just a lot of fascinating things that he experienced. And, FreeCell might have just been included as a joke. But find out more. Let's go to the pod.
I'm Aaron Cardell, and I'm here with my co-host, Nate Cadillac. Today, we're excited to speak with Jim Horne, the creator of Microsoft FreeCell, XWordinfo.com, and also a partner in a new game, Squeezy, which you can find at imsqueezy.com. Jim is a longtime software developer, writer, and musician. From handling software development management to theatrical direction, he's a veteran of many fields and has worked for prominent names like the New York Times and Microsoft, where he spent more than 26 years fulfilling multiple roles. Microsoft FreeCell was a classic game that came with the Windows operating system, being released in Windows 95 up to Windows 7. FreeCell is a solitaire card game where you have a 52-card deck, and your objective is to move all the cards to the foundation piles sorted by suit and in ascending order from ace to king. Jim, we're thrilled you're here.
I'm happy to be here.
Jim, we always like to start out. What's your favorite game to play these days?
Well, you mentioned FreeCell, and my whole career about puzzling got started because I was intrigued by that game. I didn't invent the game, but I wish I could say it did, because it's kind of a perfect solitaire game. It doesn't take long to play. You can win nearly every game, like well over 99% of them. And if you start playing, you start thinking, okay, I got this figured out. I'm going to win another one. I'm going to do another one. And then you get cocky and you get slammed down, all in about 3 minutes or so. So it's a perfect logic game, I think. Just it fits the human psychology of wanting to feel good about accomplishing something, and it's possible to do, unlike regular solitaire, but it's hard enough to always be interesting. So I'm going to say FreeCell.
Love it. That's true loyalty. So we'll probably do a deep dive on FreeCell here in a little bit, but maybe let's rewind the clock a little bit further in your journey before finding and creating a Windows version of FreeCell. I understand you grew up in Canada. You've got kind of a lot of diverse interests, but some of that includes music do I understand right? You played music at Antarctica?
Oh, I don't know where you dig out that story, but that's quite true. I've been a musician all my life, and I did a lot of theater work. And one play that I music directed included a woman who worked for a eco tour company, they call it, that took small ships down to Antarctica. And they wanted to celebrate the changing over from 1999 to 2000 by having a special trip. And so they were going to have a piano player come, and since she worked in the company, she was going to be the singer, and we were going to be entertainment on this small ship. That time was particularly interesting because you may not remember, but the world was about to end because of the Y2K crisis, and we were going to be at the far end of the world. So whatever happened, we would be either doomed or safe or something. I don't know. So yeah, we had a great time. Antarctica is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. It's got the greatest biodensity of animal life anywhere on the planet during the few weeks that every critter in the southern hemisphere has to get to Antarctica to do whatever they need to do to reproduce. It's just extraordinary. And yeah, I had a great time. That was my favorite gig by far.
It's awesome. And, in terms of just, your interest in music and the theater, do I understand like you had some involvement with Microsoft Theater and maybe conducting some, or not conducting, but directing some plays there?
Yeah, there was a Microsoft orchestra that I conducted as well. I was studying conducting, and my first chance to conduct any orchestra was the Microsoft Orchestra, which had some amazing players, some Juilliard grads, all the way to just people who had played in high school and hadn't then played for years. So that was a lot of fun. But yeah, I did theater work for them as well, music directed plays, and directed a few as well. I'm a Sondheim fan, so I got to direct Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and I did a number of other plays. I think Little Shop of Horrors is one that everyone probably knows, and that's always a super fun one to perform and to see, I think.
I think what's fascinating with a lot of our guests is just how many of them are involved in music as well. And so I'm not surprised that this is also part of your background, Jim. Where did your love of games come from? Do you have any early memories, with playing games or building games that you can share?
Sure. Just to comment on something that you just said, Nate, I worked at Microsoft for a long time, as you mentioned, and a surprising number of people there have both math and music backgrounds. They seem to tie together. We can have a philosophical discussion about why, but it's quite common. One of the best programmers who worked for me had a degree in music composition and no background formally in programming at all. And back, at least in the day, that was not uncommon. My background, yeah, I've loved games since I was a kid, I suppose. I have a lot of fond memories of camping with my family and playing cards with my dad or with my younger sister, who can still today beat me at just about every game. She's incredibly competitive, very smart, and quite humbling to play against, but it's always fun for me. Then when I got into high school and university, it was just at the beginning of the age of programmable calculators. And I consider that kind of a game too. There's very specific rules about how you can construct a program. And at the end, magic happens if you get the incantation exactly correct. I had a TRS-80, the first sort of readily available home computer. And I learned what in Canada we call the Z80 and Americans call the Z80 assembly language. And I just got fascinated by how programming worked. And then I ended up working at the University of Alberta on a system called Plato, a computer-assisted instruction system. And it had a game called FreeCell in it. So like I said, I didn't invent it. I stole it completely from this system. And so one of the first things I wanted to do when I upgraded my TRS-80 to an IBM PC was try to create a version. It didn't actually include graphics except for the ANSI characters that would do the card suits that were part of the standard character set. But it was the regular FreeCell game. I made it available before the internet happened. There was a system called CompuServe where you could upload programs and people could download them and play them. There was a thing at the time, you could make something called freeware or something called shareware. Shareware meant, yeah, you can download it and play it, but if you like it, here's an address that you can send a few bucks to. And I asked people to send $10 if they liked the game. And I was quite surprised that I got sort of inundated with $10 checks that just kept arriving month after month after month. So that was my first realization that that FreeCell was fun, that I liked creating games, and I've been involved in game creation ever since.
And Jim, yeah, I know you compliment me all the time. You think I'm really young, but I'm old enough to be a shareware author myself, and
That's great.
so I'm curious, just your experience with, I know on a lot of shareware offerings there was maybe sort of a you would unlock some additional capabilities if you paid, but I think on some it was more just almost more like almost a donation model. So what it sounds like, which of those approaches was the case for FreeCell?
I just made the whole game available and asked people to pay money. And I thought it was really interesting, sort of as a psychological experiment. Wikipedia, when it came along, did the same thing. They would give away everything for free and then ask for money. And it was successful. When I started XWord Info, this crossword puzzle website that I created, I asked people to donate, and I created 3 different donation levels by default. You could send $10 or $20 or $50, and there was no difference between the levels. There was no difference between paying anything and paying nothing. And it was, again, just sort of a psychological experiment for me. How many people would, think that they would pay more than they had to, even, for absolutely nothing? And it turned out a lot of people did. Eventually, for reasons we can get into, we went to a model when Jeff Chen came on board, where there were certain capabilities that he added that were valuable enough that we wanted to put behind the paywall. But for the first several years, it was just this shareware model, same as I had with my shareware CompuServe version of DOS-based FreeCell.
Love it. So we'll talk more about crosswords later. So you write a DOS-based version of FreeCell. A little bit later, I understand you join Microsoft as an intern, I think.
No, I was full-time from the beginning.
So you join Microsoft full-time, and somewhere along the way, you get the idea that you're going to write FreeCell for Windows. Walk us through that journey and how that came to be included with Windows.
So when Windows first started, Bill Gates was quite concerned that there was a particular and important constituency that Windows was not attractive to, and that was gamers. In the old days of DOS, games had the capability, because DOS had the capability, of writing directly to the hardware, which meant that you could have much more sophisticated graphics, much more high resolution, or not high resolution, but high refresh rate graphics. So Bill offered incentives to people that if they could create a game, they would collect the 10 best games, they would throw them into something called a Windows Entertainment Pack, and just basically give this away for $10 or something. And basically the cost of the 5.25-inch floppy and the box that it came in. And there was no copy protection on it. So it was basically, just buy this and give it away copies to all your friends. It was fun to try to do that. A guy named Wes Cherry created the first version of Solitaire, and he created then the graphics for all the different cards. So I had these available, and I thought, well, FreeCell was fun to write. I wrote FreeCell, and sort of in my spare time, then I created a Windows graphics version of the game, and I was working before Windows 95. There was a version of Windows I worked on called Windows NT that at the time was a joint, or I guess it was started as OS2 joint project with IBM, and then became Windows NT when that marriage broke up. My boss at the time did not like games. He was afraid that people were spending way too much time in their office playing games instead of, doing productive work like, finding bugs and getting the performance up and things. So as a joke, I took this version of FreeCell, I inserted it into the build of the product without telling anybody. And in the About box, I put written by, and I put my boss's name in the about box.
Love that.
So people started mentioning, seeing him in the hall and going, "Hey, great game, Dave." And he had no idea what was going on. Finally, just at like the second to last check-in for this version of Windows, somebody told Dave, or he figured it out or something. So he changed the about box to say by Jim Horne, and he put my home phone number in there. And then the last check-in was he took my home phone number out. So it went out with my credit in the about box. I moved then over to Windows 95 because I was sort of interested in this consumer version. And I wrote a couple of games for Windows 95. I wrote a version of Hearts that worked where you could have multiple players playing and so on. But I also stuck the version of FreeCell into the build there. Again, not telling anybody. You can't get away with that now. Microsoft now is a very legitimate company, and they have procedures that stop random people like me from doing random things. But it became a very popular game on Windows. We do all kinds of analytics, of course, and FreeCell was way more popular than Word or Excel or any of these programs. I think Solitaire was slightly more popular because it's easy and everyone knows how to play it. But basically, it was the top 5 or 6 of all the apps that were running on Windows for many years. It stayed in the build through Windows XP, which was the next version. There was a version of Windows called Windows ME, which we like to kind of forget about because it was a bit of a disaster. But then in more recent versions, starting I think in Windows 8, they contracted out this other company to create games, and they did a fancier version with bigger, fancier graphics and music, and they kind of wrecked the logic of the game. It didn't kind of work quite right, but it was still, FreeCell. The best part about having my name in the about box was my mom got to brag to her friends who she would go over and visit a friend and she would say, "Hey, my son's name is on your computer." And she would bring up FreeCell and bring out the about box and would say by Jim Horne. So that was, I got a lot of good mileage out of that. And my mom got even more.
Now, you mentioned you first encountered FreeCell on, I believe it was the Plato system.
Yeah, University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana had created this computer-assisted instruction system, hardware and software, that was way ahead of its time. It had touch screens even, and it had a lot of built-in stuff for you would create lessons and be able to track completion rates and have tests and be able to report results to teachers and so on. It was so far ahead of its time, and the hardware was so expensive that it never really took off. And when general purpose microcomputers like PCs and Macs became more readily available, there was just no market for it. But it included a version of this game, FreeCell. That's where I first heard about it. And the game has some history going well before that, too, under different names. The Wikipedia article talks a little bit about the history. But again, I was just so intrigued by this game because I thought it was, as I said, the perfect solitaire game. And it was a great test for me to see if I could program something to do that. A little geeky note, I actually used something called recursion in the game to figure out if a move is possible and how to move the cards. This is something that computer science students learn in school, but you never, ever use in production code. And yet, maybe the only example in Microsoft is there's examples of recursion in FreeCell that shipped for years and years and years.
Love it.
Well, I enjoy that the FreeCell game was essentially a joke slipped into the production of a Windows operating system, Microsoft operating system. That's great. I read something about, could you tell us a little bit about the time you ended up spending and being office neighbors with Steve Ballmer over at Microsoft?
You have done interesting research. Steve Ballmer is a famously loud person, and the man who hired me, his name is Brian Valentine, also incredibly boisterous. And when I first started at Microsoft, I shared an office for a couple of days with a guy named Eric Redder, who went on to become quite a big shot at Microsoft. But because I was hired as a lead, I got a private office. So I was stuck in between these two incredibly loud, boisterous people who would have arguments at top volume. And everyone asked me how could I concentrate? How could I stand this? But I learned so much about the company. Steve Ballmer at the time was the vice president of Windows. And so all the strategy stuff that was going on, got hammered out through loud conversations right across the wall from me. And I could hear pretty much every word. It gave me a lot of insights into how Microsoft worked at a high level. And, when I would have meetings with Bill Gates later, it informed my approach about how to talk about these things in a way that executives cared about and understood. But yeah, it was entertaining for sure. Microsoft, I joined Microsoft because I wanted to work for a small software company, which it was at the time. So I utterly failed in that long-term plan. But at the time, I think Microsoft had around 1,500 people, and maybe about 400 or 500 of those were programmers working on mostly Windows and Office. So yeah, it was everybody kind of knew everybody. It was a fun environment, and Steve Ballmer taught me a lot. I'm a big fan of both Steve and Bill. They come under criticism for one reason or another. I doubt Bill Gates, for example, tracks you through the vaccines that go into your arm. But they did a remarkable thing. They took a dream about what personal software could do and made a big industry that helped change the world. It's one of the most important companies that grew up in the 80s. And between them and Steve Jobs' little company down in California, the world is a lot different place.
Yeah, it really is. So you were at Microsoft till about 2015, is that right?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah. I started in 88. I worked for about 11 years. I took 5 years off to do other projects. Came back, did another 10-year stint. So yeah, that adds up to about 2015.
And then kind of some overlap there was you were writing for the New York Times. Is that right?
Yeah. One of my jobs at Microsoft, I was hired to be to run this new group because Bill was interested in this new thing called blogging. And I didn't really know anything about blogging, and neither did anybody else at Microsoft. We didn't really care about it, but maybe it should be investigated. So I started this group to investigate that. And I was thinking one night I was lying in bed doing the crossword puzzle, which I usually did just before I went to sleep. And I said, well, I should start a blog. I should figure out why people find it interesting to blog. What's this all about? But what am I going to write about? I wanted to write a blog every day for a whole month, but I'm going to run out of ideas very quickly. And of course, the inspiration was right literally in front of my nose. The crossword puzzle was there. And I thought, well, Will Short sends me something new every day. I like working on crosswords, among many other games. So, I could start a blog about crosswords. So, yeah, while I was still working at Microsoft, I got this second gig writing wordplay. I got to go to the New York Times office several times. I got to sit in on a New York Times page one meeting where all the editors, hammer out what's going to be on the next day's page one in what order. It was really fascinating. And wordplay, I lasted for 3 years. It's now run by a woman named Deb Amlin, who is great, and she has a big staff, and there's 4 or 5 people who write different posts every week, and it's become quite an important thing. And that expanded when New York Times Games picked up Wordle and Connections and all the other ones, Spelling Bee in particular. They all have blogs associated with them. They all have very enthusiastic communities of people who will point out errors, who will talk about why a certain puzzle is great or it sucks, or you complain about their streak being broken or whatever. And I hadn't anticipated that community would be so important, but it turns out it is. And New York Times Games is a profit center for that company. It helps fund the you might say, more important work of, having a news office in Russia or something. So, it's been big for the New York Times and a life-changing opportunity for me.
Yeah. So, I think that was great firsthand experience and exposure to the New York Times with the wordplay blog. Was it after that then that you created XWord Info?
Oh, I guess I didn't really explain that. So I started working on this private blog, and I wanted, as I say, to write every day. But a couple of weeks in, I was starting kind of running out of things to say. So I thought, well, maybe because some of the puzzles were fascinating, some of the puzzles were kind of boring, and I didn't want to, just denigrate puzzles that I didn't happen to like. So I thought, well, in those days, maybe I could do a statistical analysis of recent puzzles and find out something like, okay, this is the most common word used in the last year, or this is the third puzzle by this constructor, and they all have this particular quality or something. So I decided that I was going to take the digital Crosslight files that New York Times used to provide for free, or if you signed up for the wordplay access, and I was able to crack that digital format and create a little database with puzzle information. And I decided, well, I might as well make it a web page, because that way, I can share the results with people. And so that's how XWord Info started. And that in particular was why I was worried the New York Times was not going to be happy about it. Although, as I've already said, that turned out to not be the problem that I expected. It took off much more than I thought. I didn't know when I started the blog that there were already a couple of quite successful crossword blogs already. I hadn't even bothered to check. Rex Parker is the most popular one still. A woman named Amy Rinaldo has a great crossword blog where it's a sort of more analytical approach to understanding the crosswords. And they're still going to this day. If I'd have known that they were, happily going without the New York Times shutting them down, I wouldn't have worried so much. But I expected XWord Info, like my personal blog, was going to be a short-term project, because I was clearly violating copyright at least. It turns out the New York Times doesn't go after bloggers, and it turns out that they probably realize that there's some benefit for them to have external discussions about it. And I think that's probably the case, and that XWord Info became popular enough that there was enough sort of pressure on me, both internally and externally, to keep it going, that it's been going all these years later. I think it started in 2007, was that right? And so it's 2007. So here it is, 2024, and it's still chugging away. I now, thanks to the work of a lot of different people, have information about every single crossword the New York Times has ever published, going back to 1942. A gentleman named David Steinberg started this project called the Pre-Shortsian Puzzle Project, where all the puzzles that predated Will Short's entry into his job in 1993 were digitized by hand by this large group of volunteers who submitted their digitized versions, and then editors went through them, and we still get people finding little tiny bugs that we continue to update. And so we have this incredible archive of the history of these puzzles that reflect the times in really interesting ways. The puzzles from World War II, for example, often reflect the concerns of being in the middle of a war. The theme answers might be, the generals associated with each theater of operation or something like that. There was often fairly derogatory terms about Germans or Japanese that would not fly today at all, but were, part of the common discussion at the time. The references to what were popular novels or popular movies that are many long since forgotten, but things that were important at the time. And I think it's quite fascinating to go through those. David Steinberg did an amazing thing with that project of his group of all volunteers.
There's an interesting thread of, you before Microsoft, you created a shareware version of FreeCell. You chased an interest and then kind of saw that play out as being fulfilled in a certain way, being hired by Microsoft. You chased blogging and your love of crosswords, and Will Shortz offered you a position, it sounds like, as a blogger. It just feels like there's some serendipity at play here, just chasing your own interests. And I'm curious if you have anything to say to that.
Absolutely. From my grandmother helping me buy my first IBM PC, which got me interested in programming, to happening to love FreeCell, to happening to, when I applied for a job at Microsoft, I had no idea if I was going to be, good enough to work for them, but I thought it'd be an interesting company. And, they could have said yes, or no, they happened to say yes. I happened to get into a group working on Windows that, gave me an opportunity to play around with FreeCell. So many coincidences just sort of lined up. I don't think I'm unique in that, though. I think, everybody's life drastically changes from one maybe big decision, which university do I apply to some smaller decision about, where do I go for a walk today in the park and happen to, run into someone who becomes important in my life. So yeah, I'm a big believer in taking advantage of those sort of serendipitous opportunities when they arise.
Love that. It looks like your last post on your personal blog was 2016. When are you going to be writing more there?
Yeah, that's.
Do you still love writing today?
I have a blog called XWord Blog, which is the quote official blog of XWord Info. That I link to on the XWord Info homepage. That's where I will post things about, okay, this is some new feature on XWord Info, or this is some feedback that I've got. So that's the blog writing I do. I took some courses at University of Washington on fiction writing recently, and so I'm interested in exploring that. Nothing published so far, but I'll certainly let you guys know and give you a signed copy of my first major great American novel.
So going back to FreeCell, are you familiar with this game 11982, or the unsolvable instance of FreeCell?
There was an interesting question about were all FreeCell games solvable? One of the great things about FreeCell is that they pretty much all were, and to find out in the original version of FreeCell, there was 32,000 games, and the numbers from 1 to 32,000 were just a seed for a random number generator that could reliably reproduce a particular shuffle. Well, how many of those games were solvable? So I set up a system where anyone could participate. Say, yeah, I want to try this out. And I would send them 10 game numbers, and they would report back which ones they could solve and which ones they couldn't. And the ones they couldn't solve got stuck in a bucket somewhere. And eventually I got through all 32,000, and I just went to that bucket, and unsolvable games were sent out. And then, people who were very good at it were, able to solve them. And it came down to just one game that nobody could solve, the game number that you mentioned. It was surprising to me that if there was any unsolvable games, there would only just be one. That's a pretty small percentage, 1 out of 32,000. But I was able to create artificial shuffles that were obviously unsolvable. And in the original Windows XP or Windows 95 or Windows NT version of FreeCell, if you typed in game number -1 or -2, it would give this clearly non-random shuffle that you could only make 4 moves and you were done. The fact that there was only one in the 32,000 was just sort of an interesting coincidence. Many people then doubted this human-driven version of trying to find the unsolvable game. So people wrote programs to try to algorithmically solve the different games. I published the algorithm so anyone could create these 32,000 different shuffles. And the first proofs that this one game was unsolvable were just brute force proofs. An algorithm that would just try every possible move and every possible sub move and every possible move from there until the program ran for however long it took and could never find a winning solution. And that was actually it was a good proof. It was not an elegant proof, but it was a good one. And since then, other people have developed more sophisticated proofs. The more recent versions of FreeCell include much higher game numbers. I had 1 to 32,000 because that seemed like a lot, and 32,000 was close to the biggest positive integer that would fit into 15 bits in a 16-bit integer. But it was one of the more surprising things and delightful things for me about FreeCell is that so many people were caught up in this question of were all the games solvable, and coming up with all kinds of very interesting and creative algorithms to try to figure that out. A nice little side effect that I wasn't anticipating, but I was delighted by.
Did you ever want to put something on the web? Like you created the shareware version, you brought it to Microsoft. Did you ever want to create your own game on a website and have that playable, or had you done that before?
That was never a desire of mine. I liked the fact that I had created this super popular game on Windows that a lot of people played. I called it, I was proud of the fact that I was destroying productivity around the world by people who got obsessed with this silly little game. But I never tried to create more games. But then Jeff Chen, who had been my partner in XWord Info for about a decade, had this idea for a game, and he approached me about, is this something that we could do together? He had this idea that I thought was unique, unusual, and would be fun to play. So we created this game called I'm Squeezy, imsqueezy.com, which, let's see, there's been, as we're recording, there's been 120 games so far out in the wild. Jeff's a brilliant crossword constructor and very creative at understanding how wordplay works. He was anxious to learn more about coding websites, and so I was able to help him a bit with that. But mostly he dove into it himself, and he's sort of a self-taught programmer. But it turns out the internet is full of help for people who want to try to learn that kind of stuff. And I think he's created a really fun game, and I've been very proud to be able to help him realize this little dream of his. He's got some other ideas too, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's other creations that he comes up with, and I hope I get to be involved in reifying them for the world.
Love that. We had, as you know, we had Jeff on episode 16, if you're curious, to talk more about Squeezy. And yeah, it was a game that really drew me in right away. I immediately got it. I play it in one of my, my list of games every day. Squeezy's right there. And so, yeah, that's been really fun. And so really cool to see you partner in that and be a part of it.
Yeah, a great opportunity for me. And Jeff is just a super fun guy to work with. So since we participating on XWord Info together, it was a great chance for me to keep that relationship going. As I say, it's just super fun.
Well, if you were to, have any takeaways from your career that, if there's aspiring game creators listening to this, what advice might you share with them?
The hardest thing about creating a new game is coming up with an idea. But there are lots of great games that you probably know about and you probably love to play. And you think, well, I wish it worked this way, or I wish it did this instead. And from there to creating the actual game, that needs some work. You've got to, if you depending on your programming background, you might have to learn a whole bunch of different new skills. But those new skills are also a game. They're also fun. They also have rules that when you understand the rules and you can construct a logic around them, you get the payoff that's better than just the congratulations payoff that you see in a game that you play online. You get a working little puzzle. I think I've already referred to programming as like magic, but it really is, in that you need to have the incantation exactly right. You need to figure out the right ingredients and mix them in the right order. But then magic happens. Pixels dance on the screen. Nobody understands how all levels of software works. You write in a high-level language like JavaScript or Python, and that somehow turns into machine code that somehow generates pixels that move on the screen through deep knowledge of which needs complicated understanding of quantum mechanics that drives, how modern semiconductors work. It's just a lot of different layers. But now the world gives a lot of that to you for free. You can program at a high level using a language that you can learn about on the web and practice about with the cheapest computer. And if you like games, creating games is, to me, at least as fun and as satisfying. And, maybe you get to spread the joy to your friends or even broader around the world. And that's great.
Well, this has been great, Jim. And really appreciate the walkthrough of your journey. If you want people to find you online, where should they look?
Well, XWordinfo.com has links to send me email. That's probably the best way. Those emails will go to both me and Jeff, so don't say anything bad about Jeff. But that's my sort of public email address now. So I'm happy to correspond with anyone who wants to ask further questions or comment on anything you've heard today.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, Jim.
All right. My pleasure.